Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment for the Sigma FPL. Now, this is the world's smallest full-frame camera, of course, other than the original Sigma FP, but now we've got a 61 megapixel sensor. We also have a hybrid autofocus system that does not exist on the original FP. We also have the ability to power this with a power bank over the Type-C port, something you also cannot do with the original FP. But that pretty much is where things end in terms of differentiating this from the original Sigma FP. At $2,500 US, it is expensive. However, I think it's really a value at that price point when you take into account the capability it has with regard to being a cinema camera, as well as a high-resolution full-frame camera with hybrid autofocus and eye autofocus capability. We don't have a fully implemented touchscreen on the back. It is a fixed LCD. That's why you can go for the optional $700 EVF that you see right here. Some of you will absolutely want this, and this is yet another clear sign that Sigma is differentiating the FPL from the original FP as being more of a hybrid than the original, because the original did not have an electronic EVF with an articulating capacity. Instead, it only had an optical viewfinder. So, a clear sign, again, that Sigma is being more aggressive with this camera than the original FP and really trying to appeal to a whole other audience. You could argue a broader audience that's more interested in hybrid capability, but since the original FP is not discontinued, they are really complementary cameras, and it's something where if you already own an FP and you want an FP that can take amazing stills, well, that's where the L comes in. So, landscape photography, architectural shots, I could absolutely see having one of these in my bag, especially if I owned more L-mount glass. Unfortunately, I don't. I predominantly own E-mount glass, and that's kind of where my love affair with this camera ends. And that's not a knock against Sigma, it's strictly a matter of, do I want to give up all of my E-mount glass and switch systems? This camera does not give me that feeling, that desire yet, but I think Sigma's on the right path. So, again, to reiterate, if you are looking for simply the cinema camera that the FP represents with 24 megapixel capability, go with the less expensive original FP. You'll have the same battery life, all the same video capability, you just won't have the things I mentioned at the beginning. The higher resolution sensor, it is a newer sensor, as well as the ability to essentially run this continuously by powering it over the Type-C port, which, by the way, you lose once you attach the EVF, because if you want to do external capture, you can still do that over this Type-C port that is channeled through the EVF. You also have a headphone jack for monitoring, but that's pretty much it. So that's something you need to be aware of. Also, for me personally, I would rather have the FPL, because to me, the whole appeal of the world's smallest full-frame camera is the fact that it's a cinema camera and a high-resolution one at that. So this directly competes with my A7R4, and Sigma's going in the right direction. I love the form factor. Some people will argue that the ergonomics are not great, but once you get Sigma's grip that you see attached right here, the ergonomics are perfectly fine. Would I like to see an articulating screen? Sure, but I like that we have a heat sink on this, which means you don't have to worry about overheating. And even though the autofocus system is hybrid, I would be, confusing all of you if I were to say it's best in class. It's not. It is far better than the original FP, which was simply contrast-based. However, it is not going to rival the A7R4 that I currently use as my daily driver. And that's where I get to the things that I would like to see Sigma do for this camera. So I've mentioned that it is a legit cinema camera, and it is. DCI 4K 24p is here. Color profiles out the wazoo, 12-bit out of external capture at least. Internally, though, we are capped at 8-bit, and that's one thing that I think Sigma needs to take to the next level. If they give us 10-bit, at least 10-bit internally, like you can get with basically most full-frame flagship mirrorless cameras these days, that's going to put the Sigma FP right up next to my A7R4 that I have right here. But that's a step that has to happen in order to get on this camera's level. And the reason the A7R4 is the best comparison is, of course, It also has a 60 plus megapixel sensor, but the autofocus system here is much better than what you'll get with the FPL. Bear in mind, though, that most cinema shooters who actually appreciate that they're getting a cinema camera out of this, not just a high-res sensor, will shoot predominantly manually. And that's why I don't think the autofocus system has ever been a huge emphasis for Sigma, which is completely understandable. But if they can bring 10-bit internal recording to this, as well as give us in-body image stabilization, aka IBIS, which is another thing I would love to see on here, I think Sigma has basically one of the best cameras on the market. And that's without even improving the autofocus system, because people that are interested in this already know that autofocus is not a strong suit of the original FP or even the FPL. The FPL is an improvement because now we do have a true still camera that's high res that you can absolutely use for print work and get beautiful stills out of. And I'm not saying you can't do that with the original FP, but this is much better in the still capacity with that 61 megapixel sensor. Now, whether or not you need this is really clearly a matter of personal preference, but it's good that Sigma brought it on. It's easily removed, and that's what I like about it. So if you don't care about having the electronic EVF, don't buy it. They do bundle it with it at a slight discount. It does have good quality overall. You do have an LCD EVF switch because it does not have a sensor to detect when you are using it. But also with the latest firmware, you can use the menu button to switch back and forth so you don't have to use that switch, which is nice. Weather sealing on this is solid. Phenomenal build quality overall. There's that Type-C port that I was mentioning. You can power the device through, but you'll be relegated again to internal recording. So no 10-bit if you do that. And that's what I was getting at earlier, is that that is a bottleneck on this camera that hopefully in the next revision will be addressed. We don't have a full-size HDMI out. You probably noticed that already. We have a microphone port here, and then we do have quarter 20 mounts on either side of the body. Once you mount this, though, you lose it, and so Sigma gives you another on the grip itself. Controls are very straightforward. The power button, in the original Sigma FP, not an issue, but with this EVF attached, it's a little bit difficult to get to just because the EVF is literally blocking it if you plan on switching it off with anything other than your right hand. So that's just food for thought, not a big deal. When it comes to the actual layout and the dial, I think these are all solid controls. The dedicated large record button, the cinema and still switch, all of the design is exactly the same as on the original FP, and so is the menu system. And that is something that could use a refresh. I think that's something Sigma will get to eventually, but I think this needs to be a compelling offering that a lot of people are going to pick up. And right now, it's there. I think there are a lot of people that will enjoy it, but most consumers aren't really familiar with Sigma as anything other than a lens manufacturer. They're more focused on buying glass for their cameras made by Sigma. After all, high quality glass, affordable pricing, everything's made in Japan. What's not to like? And the same applies here with this camera. I think it's a little marvel of technology, but I think it's still in what I would refer to somewhat of a developmental phase. And for some shooters, you're going to absolutely love this thing. But for other people who are looking just to run and gun and don't care about its form factor, they aren't going to see the appeal here. And I get that. The menu, again, leaves some things to be desired. You do have a crop factor when shooting 4K video of 2.5 times. In 1080p, it's 5 times. So that's another nice thing that you can do on the fly. It's not groundbreaking, but it's good to have. And, overall, again, what Sigma has put into this camera, the director's viewfinder, also found on the FP, another great value built into this little camera that essentially replaces a director's viewfinder that would range anywhere from, 5 to 15 grand. And you have that with various looks of different cameras, whether it's Venice, whatever it may be, you've got it on here so that you can easily simulate that look, record it, and then know what you're going to get out of this camera, which you can't really do with anything else other than a real director's viewfinder. Now let's talk about the glass. You already know this shoots DCI 4K. You already know that in order to get the most out of what it's able to do on the cinema side, you need to capture externally. That means having, an NVMe like this, Sabrent makes smaller ones. You can go with Samsung's T line of drives, the T7, the T5. But 1 terabyte will get you 1 hour of the highest quality video this outputs, the 12-bit DNG RAW. So be aware of that. It is a monster, and that's another thing Sigma has to work on, I think, down the road, is getting a leaner codec enabled so that whether you're going external or they actually do give us a solution for internal capture, we need to get more efficient. But that's a nitpick in my opinion at this point. There are other things that need to be addressed to really make this one of the best cameras on the market. And I have high hopes for it because this is the form factor I really appreciate. It reminds me of the RX-1. I said it with the original FP. You're looking at about an hour of battery life with this battery. It's the same battery from the previous generation. There's your UHS slot for your SD card. And that's, another thing that thankfully a limitation that was addressed with being able to charge it over the Type-C port. Now, when it comes to the other dedicated buttons, your mode button, your color, profile, tone, it's all here. It's all good. They've got waveforms on board. I have nothing to play back, unfortunately, for all of you. So they've really gone out of their way to, I think, deliver a fully realized product. But again, the broad appeal that some might think it would have based on paper specs, it doesn't, because really ultimately this is all about its form factor, in my opinion. And once you start to build it out, I mean, Sigma did send me a cage with this, and you absolutely can build it out. It's a cinema camera and a full frame 61 megapixel bare sensor. You can do a lot of things with it, but I think in its purest form, it's really best for using on things like gimbals and drones. That's where a camera like this thrives. I think that if you're hiking, anything out in the field and you want something incredibly small, but that is going to give you fantastic still and video quality, this does still fit the bill. But you need good glass. What Sigma sent over for review, specifically, here is the 28 to 70 mil f2.8 DGDN, a great pairing with this. This is actually my favorite. You've got beautiful quality throughout the range, and it really matches the camera incredibly well. Again, excuse the fact that I don't have an SD card in here, which it's going to constantly remind us of in duplicates. And again, this is really about, do you want to have a true hybrid? The first Sigma FP on paper, absolutely a hybrid, but as reviewed when I did last year, it leans more towards being a cinema camera in its true form. Here, it is more of a blend. There's no question about it. And this is a perfect lens for this camera. If you want to go prime, go prime. The other lens that was sent over is the 35 mil f1.4 DGDN, and this is a great piece of glass, but it is going to bulk this up, and it isn't going to give you a lot of range. It definitely makes it feel more like a street photography camera. After all, we've got a very fast 35 mil, which is ideal for that. But I really prefer having the 28 to 70 zoom. It's smaller, it's still very fast at f2.8, and pretty much ideal for, I think, the hybrid that this camera represents. Now, Sigma does have smaller lenses for it, so if you want to keep it more compact, you can. And, if we weren't in a pandemic, I would say this is getting closer to being a perfect travel camera. Even though I love my A7R4, if we could make it smaller, I'm all for it. So Sigma's on the right path. It's just a matter of checking some more boxes, which I think they can do. And this is going to be a dream camera eventually. We're still not there. I think once we have, again, internal 10-bit, I can live with the autofocus system here, even though it's not going to touch the A7R4. I have to think about portability compared to the A7R4. And even if you were just to pair it with a small prime, like Sigma's 45 original kit lens, I believe was the original kit for the FP, you're still going to get great results with this, both in still and video. And that's something you're not going to achieve with anything else on the market, again, in this form factor. So if you're putting this on a gimbal, it's ideal. If you want first person, FPV on a drone, you're going to get it out of a camera like this, which is going to be much more difficult to achieve with an alternative competing product like the A7R4. But it's going to be hard to make the argument, to replace an A7R4 like I have with a wide collection of glass, because, the A7R4 isn't that much larger. It feels like it's about twice the size. The ergonomics are better. You have a great EVF here. You have a tilting display. Obviously it's not a cinema camera. It's going to overheat. This pretty much won't. But if you're fully vested like me, again, there's just not enough for me going with the FPL to say I'm ditching my A7R IV. And they're close in price. This is a little over $3,000. This is $2,500. And some will argue you're getting more for your money with Sony, which is a rare thing to be said. Now, where I think Sigma can really hit this out of the park is if they turn this into an RX1 style camera. Because right now, pros look at this and they say, why do I need the small form factor? Unless they're doing what I just mentioned, which is throwing it on a gimbal or a drone. Otherwise, they're going to say, for this much money, there are so many other cameras I can look at with similar features, not really the 61 megapixel sensor, but similar cinema video features, and I can get better autofocus. I can get a lot of things I'm not getting with the Sigma that I'm sacrificing for its incredibly small form factor. And they're right. So I think for Sigma to turn this into the home run that they've always planned, they need to come back to what Sony did with the RX1. When you look at the RX1, Sony walked away from this. They have the A7C now, and maybe that is the replacement ultimately to the RX1. But the beauty of the RX1 was its incredibly small form factor, full frame, paired, this was a 24 megapixel sensor, paired with a phenomenal 35mm prime. This sold incredibly well. Sony, essentially was praised industry-wide for it because there was nothing else like it on the market. It reminded most of a Leica experience, but not at a Leica price. It was around $3,000 US. And it's still one of my favorite cameras to this day. In fact, my original one was destroyed along with a lot of my gear by Hurricane Matthew. I repurchased it because I love this little camera. Now, I wish it had 4K video capture. The refresh didn't bring any of that. It did bring the autofocus system from the A7R II that I have right here, another favorite of mine, but it's incomplete. To me, in order to make the RX1 truly be succeeded, we need something like the Sigma FPL. And I think Sigma can do it. I think that if Sigma pairs one of their phenomenal pieces of prime glass to this and builds it on, and it's very rare that I would suggest, essentially putting a fixed lens on a camera like this, but if they did it, I think that this would get broad appeal that right now the FP and FPL simply do not have. Of course, if they improve the autofocus and also give 10-bit, all of those things, it'll make it even more compelling. But if they did something as simple as put a phenomenal piece of their own glass, let's say 35 or a 24mm, something in that capacity, and glued it on to the FPL, I think that this would be the sort of camera that not only gearheads would be looking at and pros and hobbyists with big budgets, but regular shooters that are spending thousands of dollars on Sony, Canon, not so much Nikon, Fuji gear in order to get images and video they know they can't achieve with their cell phones, because that seems to be the market now. It's you either, you're using a smartphone or you have a camera that's several $1,000s. People don't believe in point and shoot anymore. That's an argument for a separate time. But that's where I think Sigma has a really big opportunity to turn this into a point and shoot friendly, full frame, cinema, still monster that no one else is making right now, literally. I mean, Sony had it, they dropped it. It's Sigma's opportunity to claim that, in my opinion, because this camera presents that opportunity. And then all of a sudden, they have the ability to pull in consumers that I just mentioned that really, they want something that differentiates from their smartphone. And boy, will this do that, if it is given a proper opportunity. And it'll go from being a niche camera that appeals to people like me, but I'm still not even sold because I'm already fully vested in Sony's E-mount ecosystem. And that's where it would even be appealing to me if it had a fixed lens on it. And I could say, wow, if I want incredible quality both on the still and video side without bringing my whole gear bag, one of my Sony or two of my Sony bodies, as well as a collection of glass, I can just grab the FPL, whatever they want to call it, the FPL Elite. I don't know, I'm making things up now, but I think you see where I'm going. That's where all of a sudden this camera envisions something like this. So not as small as the RX, because it still has to have a similar form factor in order to achieve what the FPL and FP does right now, but cut down that glass, make it kind of idiot-proof, whereas right now the FPL is something I feel like only more advanced shooters are going to want to pick up, both on the video and still side. And all of a sudden, you've opened up your market to so many different customers, both pro and hobbyist alike. And then you're going to get people like grandparents, parents that want to shoot their kids. That sounds wrong, you know, I mean, with a camera. And that is going to be huge for Sigma. So Sigma, I hope you're listening. I love the FP. The FPL is even better. But I think the way they turn this camera, or at least make another complementary model that's going to grab everyone's attention and become something that is going to be a top seller, is by basically recreating what Sony gave up with the RX-1. Tell me what you think in the comments. I'm curious. I mean, I've always loved the RX-1, and I just don't feel like we have a successor, even though all of the hardware is out there to make one. So that's just my opinion, my take. And of course, you know, even without an EVF, just give us an articulating screen with a little more touch capability, because this maintains the same, pretty much the same touch capacity as the FP. And all of a sudden, we have a pocketable photographic tool and video tool unlike any on the market. Sigma can do it. I know it. They've got the lenses. They've got the body. And for those of you that don't know, as I mentioned earlier in this video, you know, in Japan, Sigma is known for their cameras, not just their glass. In the US, it's very, you know, lens centric, and I understand why. But I think that what they've got going here is the foundation for an amazing camera that we don't have yet. Now, does this mean you shouldn't buy this? No, it doesn't. As I said earlier, if I didn't already own a wide bevy of E-mount glass that I already am very happy with, I would probably start investing in L-mount glass with the at least hope that this is going to continue to become the flagship that it should be. Meaning they'll revise the body next year, give us a bigger battery, all the things I've alluded to, a tiltable display. I don't really care about the EVF. After all, I love the FX3. I did a comparison of these two, and they're very different. The FX3 isn't a hybrid. This is, and I prefer a hybrid, but again, Sigma's got to give me more, and I know they can do it. The 10-bit internal is definitely on that wish list. The IBIS, again, the autofocus doesn't have to be perfect, but if they want to make that fixed lens version of this that I'm talking about, they will need to step up the autofocus game, because part of the beauty of using my A7R4 is that even when I'm not shooting it, if I hand it to someone else, I'm not worried about whether or not they're going to make the mark. I can put it in auto like it is right now, and they'll take a good photo. Doesn't matter what their capability is, the camera can adapt. This, on the other hand, it's not going to do that, and that's where if Sigma, again, builds in a fantastic prime, even if they make it a $3,000 camera, I think they have something that's going to sell, because there's just this huge vacuum right now of people buying cameras they don't know how to use to get something better than their iPhone or Samsung phone. I mean, that's just a fact of life. They're not interested in point-and-shoot cameras. I get it, even though I still use them for convenience. But Sigma could replace that with something like this. And even if they did it with the 24-megapixel version, and it was a far less expensive option, like make it a, you know, put it at the current FP pricing, $1,700 or $1,500, I think they have a winner. Now, some of you will think I'm nuts with this, but I think it's one of the ways that they can leverage what they've designed and created here to make it far more marketable. It's something I know I would want to buy, because then I wouldn't have to invest in the lens system. I would have just an incredible point-and-shoot camera like the original RX-1. And again, no one has done anything to answer that. So to recap, phenomenal build quality, average battery life, best video quality is only going to come out of it externally, which is going to, just like the original FP, eat up NVMe SSDs for breakfast. In addition to that, you know, if you do want an EVF, it's great that we have the option now. Like I said in my first look, it is a good EVF. It is expensive, but it's worth it if you're after shooting stills with this, you need to have the EVF. I will say that now. This is not going to be ideal to shoot stills with on a fixed display like this. It just isn't. The display is good, but it not being able to move, again, reminds you that this is a cinema camera. And it is. But it needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. I definitely, as I stated at the top of this video, would go with the FPL over the original FP. But if you don't care about the 61 megapixels or the ability to exceed the runtime of the standard battery using the Type-C port, get the original FP. There's nothing to think about. If, like me, you love that this has become a hybrid unlike any other, go with the FPL. And yes, I could keep going back to the A7R4 that I have over here that's my daily driver, but that doesn't make a lot of sense because ultimately, even though they're so similar in terms of their sensor and video performance, they're also incredibly different. As I stated, this is not going to overheat. This is almost as small as a point-and-shoot camera, whereas the A7R4 is unquestionably, an alternative to a digital SLR, as it is, pointed to be. So Sigma's onto something here. I love that they haven't given up. They're aggressive with firmware updates, but I can definitely recommend this if you understand what you're getting yourself into. I think, a lot of people have reviewed this and dismissed it. I think that's a mistake. I think there are a lot of users that love this form factor, love the capability that it offers. It just means that you have to work a little bit harder and know exactly what you want. It's a more refined consumer than the average one. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. But Sigma can make it that, I think, if they do something to the effect of what I've suggested with the fixed lens and make it something that's complete out of the box, that all someone will need to buy are additional SD cards and batteries. And then all of a sudden, you've got a camera that for many users is going to replace a gear bag. And it's going to be the ideal holiday high-end travel camera that's not the $6,000 Zeiss craziness or Leica craziness. And Sigma has this opportunity. I hope that they do something with it because I will be one of the first to jump on board with that. As far as the L-mount, again, if you already have L-mount glass, I don't see why you wouldn't entertain this. And if you're not already invested in another mount heavily, like I am, I don't see why you wouldn't entertain it. The Sigma glass is affordable, has great quality. Both of these were fantastic with this, both in still and video. May seem redundant. And like, I don't know how much better you've done some repeating here, but that's because I really like this camera. It's so close to being something that will end up in my bag. And hey, if Sigma does entertain my fixed lens idea, again, I think they will have a camera that will sell to everyone in the family. This isn't going to be limited to, again, the niche audience that I've been saying over and over again that the FPL appeals to right now. I think they really have an opportunity here to take this to the next level. That pretty much wraps up my review. Again, a stellar little camera that fits in the palm of your hand. I love it, but I have to wait to see what Sigma has up their sleeve next. If you think you're going to jump on it, let me know. I'm really curious because, again, this is unmatched right now in the marketplace when it comes to its form factor and overall capability. Nothing else like it on Earth. Good job, Sigma. Keep it up. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe and please stay safe. Later.